In this last lecture segment for Chapter 1, we'll discuss anatomical terms. So here we'll learn how to reference the body's parts and regions, and we'll also familiarize ourselves with anatomical directions, regions, and planes of sectioning. So these are important because they give us a standardized, universally accepted language that allows us to communicate quickly and effectively about the body and its parts. So in order to give us an initial reference point so that we may give direction to the body, we have to have a standardized position. So regardless if the person that we're referring to is sitting down or lying down, we will describe their body parts as though they were in anatomical position. And anatomical position is our standardized reference point that we're going to use here. This short list here are the attributes for anatomical position. So we're going to assume that the person that we're referring to, they are standing and their body is upright. We're going to assume that their eyes are open and they're facing forward, their palms are forward, and their feet are about shoulder width apart. So that's anatomical position. If we look at the major divisions of the body, we see that there are two primary divisions. We have the axial division here in orange, which includes the head, thoracic region, and the abdominal region, and the appendicular division, which includes the upper limbs and the lower limbs. So informally, I want to kind of make a note here that we usually refer to this region here as the arm, but anatomically we need to describe them as the upper limb, because the term arm in anatomy specifically refers to the region between the shoulder and the elbow, which is this region right about here. So this would be the arm, this would be the forearm, and this would be the hand. So we need to collectively refer to this structure as the upper limb. Informally also, we generally refer to this structure as the leg, but anatomically we need to describe them as the lower limbs, as this term leg in anatomy refers to the region that's below the knee but above the ankle. So this region right here would be the leg. The lower limbs are actually composed of the thigh, the leg, and the foot. So those are our two major divisions for the body. So let's look at some directional terms, and we'll describe and define these directional terms here. So this term anterior means towards the front. The term ventral can also be used interchangeably to refer to anterior. So whether you want to use the term anterior or ventral, they're both anatomically correct. So I have really no preference for either one. So whichever one you want to refer to, as long as you're referring to them correctly, I have no problem with. So we have anterior, which means towards the front. Posterior means towards the back or behind. And you also see here in this diagram that the term dorsal can be used to refer to posterior. So again here, if you want to use posterior or dorsal, those are both correct terms. The term superior or cephalad means above, and the term inferior or caudal means below. So we'll only use the directional terms in reference to humans. So we can use similar terms when referring to four-legged animals, but because this is a human biology class, we'll only use these directional terms as they apply to humans. So you can ignore part B of this diagram here. Other directional terms include proximal and distal, and proximal and distal are a little tricky to use because they are terms that refer to points on the limbs. So proximal is a position on a limb that is closest to the shoulder or to the hip. And so, for example, using the lower limb here, the knee would be proximal with respect to the ankle because the knee is closer in proximity to the hip than the ankle is. So with proximal and distal, you're always referring to two structures and whether they're proximal or distal with respect to one another. To use the term distal here, distal is a position on a limb that is further from the shoulder or the hip. So in my same example here with the lower limb, the ankle would be distal to the knee because the ankle is further away from the hip than the knee is. Okay. So we've seen those directional terms here. The last few directional terms that we have to describe here are medial on this diagram here. Medial means closest to the midline here, and lateral is the opposite of that. It means further from the midline. Also on this diagram here too, I wanted to point out the terms right and left are always with respect to the person that we're observing. So as you can see, over here, even though to us, the observer, this is on the left side, this would actually be the right side of this woman's body here. And so the terms right and left are always given with respect to the person that we're observing. Okay, so the last of the directional terms that we'll take a look at here are the terms superficial and deep. And superficial means close to the external surface, while deep means far below the external surface. So to give you an example of superficial here, usually the way that particularly the limbs are laid out is that we have superficially, we have the skin, a little bit deeper to the skin, we have the muscles, and then even deeper to the muscles, we have the bones. So with respect to the skin, the muscles would be considered deep, and the skin would be superficial to both the muscles and the bones here, but the muscles and bones would be deep when compared to the skin. So there we've given some examples of the terms superficial and deep, and used them in some examples there as well. So this is quite a large diagram here, and what it's showing is the surface anatomy terms for different parts of the body. And so you'll want to go through and make sure that you are familiar with all of these terms that are on this particular diagram here. It can be found in both the lecture textbook and the lab manual. And what you're seeing on this diagram here is that the anatomical name of the region is outside of the parentheses here, and inside of the parentheses is a description of that particular region. So for example here, if we single out the carpal region here, instead of saying wrist, the correct anatomical term for the wrist region is called the carpal region. Same for the nose here, for example. Instead of calling it the nose, we call it the nasal region. The nose is simply, in this diagram, simply gives a description of that particular region. Most of these are fairly self-explanatory, but the description is helpful for things that are not as easily described from their name. Okay, so continuing on, let's take a look at sectioning planes. So for anatomical studies, the body is often cut, which is also called sectioning, along a flat surface called a plane. Now, imaging technologies allow us to look internally without cutting. So that is, we can still study the body's internal parts and workings, but we don't have to make cuts in order to do it. So these imaging technologies allow us to look internally without cutting, but what you're seeing here is they're still taking images of the body along these flat surfaces or planes. So it's as though we made a section or cut through that body with our imaging technology. Of course, we didn't actually cut through it, which is very useful to us because we can get an internal look at the body very quickly and easily. So what we end up with these imaging technologies is that we end up with slices of three-dimensional objects. And so we're essentially taking a three-dimensional object and looking at it from one two-dimensional perspective. So to give you an example of this, we'll kind of turn to a more simple and familiar object. We'll look at the sectioning planes as they apply to sectioning this banana here. And so what I want to make the point here is that objects look different depending on the sectioning plane here. And so we have an example here of two different planes. So if we have sort of a little cross section here through the center of the banana, we get this kind of circular structure with the skin on the outside of it. But if we sectioned it along its midline, we would get a very different looking shape indeed. We would still have kind of the fruit part of the banana and the skin, but we get a different picture than we did with this sectioning plane on the left here. So you can see that with different sectioning planes, the same object looks different, right? The same object may look different even when cut in the same plane, just in a different position. So here we have a horizontal plane that's cutting through the center of the banana, so we get this kind of oval-shaped appearance to it. If we move that same plane superiorly a little bit, then, and we were to also make the same cut, we would be missing the middle of the banana here, but we would cut through the two end pieces of it, so we'd see these two sort of round end pieces. So depending on where we cut or make sectioning planes in our sample, the object may look very different and unfamiliar to us. So let's take a look at the planes of sectioning. We'll look at 4 planes of sectioning, and we'll describe their attributes here. We'll start with the median or mid-sagittal plane here. Now, median planes are planes that section the body or object into a right half, or I should say a right part and a left part. If the right and left parts are symmetrical, then the plane is called a mid-sagittal plane. But if it's kind of off center a little bit, then we still get right and left parts, but they are not a mid-sagittal plane. We also have frontal or coronal planes, and frontal or coronal planes section the body or object into an anterior part and a posterior part. The third of our 4 planes here is a transverse plane. This is also called a cross-section. And transverse or cross-section planes section the body or object into a superior part and an inferior part. Now, a 4th plane that is not as commonly used, but I'll describe here just so you're familiar with it, is an oblique plane. And an oblique plane is a plane that makes cuts or sections diagonally between horizontal and vertical planes here. So these are not as frequently used because they are not very straightforward to analyze. So really, any of the images that you'll be looking at within this book or within the lab manual or even the lectures that I show you here will be in either the median, the frontal, or the transverse planes, but rarely we will look at things in the oblique plane because they're not very straightforward to analyze. So here I just wanted to familiarize you with the term oblique plane. Okay. So let's turn our attention to some internal anatomy. We've looked at some surface anatomy so far, and we've looked at the planes of sectioning and things like that. So let's turn our attention briefly to the internal anatomy. And to do that, we'll look at the body's cavities. So we see that the body's major organs are contained within body cavities in the head, thoracic region, and the abdomen. The upper and lower limbs do not really contain any major cavities because these are really kind of largely packed with bone, skeletal muscle, skin, nerves, and blood vessels, but there really aren't any body cavities within the upper or lower limbs to speak of. So they're mostly kind of densely packed with bone, muscle, blood vessels, nerves, and skin. So let's look at the body cavities here. If we look at the bodies from a lateral perspective and an anterior perspective on the right there, we see that the body has 2 major divisions of cavities here. We have the dorsal body cavity and the ventral body cavity, or ventral body cavities here in red, I should say. So let's take a look at the dorsal body cavity first. So the dorsal cavity is subdivided into the cranial cavity, which houses the brain, and the spinal cavity, which houses the spinal cord. Both of these cavities are just about completely surrounded by bone. The cranial cavity is completely encased by bone. The spinal cavity, pretty much for the most part, is also fully surrounded by bone, even though the arrangement of bones in the vertebral column is a lot less, I guess I should say a lot less solid than, or a lot less, the connections are not as strong between the bones of the vertebral column as we see in the bones of the skull here. So the bones of the vertebral column are kind of linked together like a chain, where the cranial bones are more basically almost fused together. In any case, though, the dorsal body cavity's divisions are completely surrounded by bone. Even though we make an anatomical distinction between these 2 cavities as well, these 2 cavities are not physically separated from one another. That is, the cranial cavity is continuous with the spinal cavity here. Turning our attention to the ventral cavity, we see that the ventral cavity is actually subdivided into two regions. We have the thoracic and the abdominal pelvic cavity regions, and they are actually physically separated from one another by a muscle called the diaphragm muscle. This is a dome-shaped skeletal muscle that contracts and flattens out when we breathe, and so this is an important muscle in breathing, but it's also an important anatomical landmark because it marks the place where the thoracic cavity ends and the abdominal pelvic cavity begins. So let's take a look more closely at the thoracic cavity. So the major subdivisions of the thoracic cavities, on the right and left sides of the thoracic cavity, we have these two cavities called the pleural cavities, and each of these pleural cavities contains one of the lungs. There are superior and inferior cavities kind of located within the center of the thoracic cavity. The superior-most of the cavities in the thoracic cavity is the mediastinum. It contains the esophagus, which is part of the digestive system, and the trachea, which is part of the respiratory system. And just inferior to that, or just below that, is the pericardial cavity, which, as its name implies here, cardial, it contains the heart. So that does it for the thoracic cavity. Let's turn our attention to the abdominal pelvic cavity here. Now this cavity primarily contains the digestive and the urinary system organs, and we can actually subdivide this cavity as well into two divisions. We can divide it into the abdominal cavity, which is kind of the superior most of the abdominal pelvic cavity subdivisions, and then the pelvic cavity is the inferior most of the cavities that sits pretty firmly between the pelvis there, or between the bones of the pelvis there. So because the abdominal pelvic cavity is a large cavity and it contains several organs, it helps to divide it into smaller areas or regions for study. So therefore we refer to 9 different regions of the abdominal pelvic cavity. So across the top here, just underneath the diaphragm muscle, we have the right hypochondriac region, which largely contains the liver and the gallbladder. Really kind of the bulk of the liver is contained in the right hypochondriac region, even though the liver does span 2 of the regions of the abdominal pelvic cavity. Most of it is contained in the right hypochondriac region, which is just below just underneath and within the lower of the ribs in the rib cage. The epigastric region is a region that's right in the top center of the abdominal pelvic cavity, and it contains the stomach. And the left hypochondriac region largely contains the spleen. Moving towards the center of the abdominal pelvic regions, we see that the right region here, the right central region here, is called the right lumbar region, and it contains a part of the large intestine called the ascending colon. Now, the large intestine essentially borders and frames the small intestine because the small intestine is more centrally located within the umbilical region here. So the large intestine kind of spans several regions within the abdominal pelvic cavity. So within the right lumbar region, we largely see the ascending colon of the large intestine. The umbilical region, which is centrally located, contains really the bulk of the small intestine, and the left lumbar region to the side of it contains the descending colon of the large intestine. The inferior most of the 9 abdominal pelvic regions are the right iliac or right inguinal region that largely contains the appendix, which is this little pocket-like sac that is a part of the large intestine. The hypogastric region, right in the bottom center here, is also called the pubic region, and it contains the urinary bladder. The left iliac or left inguinal region over here contains an S-shaped region of the large intestine called the sigmoid colon. This word sigmoid just means S-shaped. So this is an S-shaped bend that's in the large intestine, and it's found within the left iliac or inguinal region. So that kind of does it for the major body cavities. A couple of other body cavities that we'll briefly turn our attention towards here are the orbital cavities, which contain the eyes. These are also just referred to as the orbit or the orbital cavities here. The nasal cavity contains the sensory structures that give us our sense of smell, and they're located within kind of the center of the skull there. The oral cavity is also referred to as our mouth. And the middle ear cavity is a small space that is where the middle ear bones are located, and it leads to the sensory structures of the inner part of the ear. The last of the body cavities here that we'll take a look at are actually cavities that exist between two bones here called synovial cavities. And synovial cavities are a type of cavity where you've got two bones that come together, and the ends of those two bones are surrounded by a fibrous capsule, and there is a viscous, slippery fluid that is found within the synovial cavity that really helps to lubricate the two ends of the bones and make sure that those bones can move across one another without being damaged or destroyed in the process.